Thanks so much for joining our program this morning, Go Green or Go Home Election Edition. This is the final webinar in our series on solar issues for the real estate industry. And today we have four awesome speakers to guide us through the changing solar policy in a rapidly changing political landscape. So I'm Alexis Saba. I'm an attorney at the environmental and energy law firm Sive, Paget, and Riesel, co-hosting the program today with Rob Crauderueff, who's the CEO of Crauderueff Solar. He's going to be our moderator. But before I kick it off to Rob, we will have about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of the program. So you can submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen as we go, and we'll kind of get those collected to drop in at the end. Everyone's muted and your cameras are off, so the Q&A is the best way to communicate. So Rob, I'll kick it off to you to introduce the panelists and get started.
Okay, thank you, Alexis. We have a really awesome panel here today. We are joined by Adriana Espinoza, who's Senior Advisor for Environmental Justice with the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate Policy and Programs. Rich Kassel, who is the Clean Energy and Sustainability Group Leader at Capalino. Bracken Hendricks, who's CEO and founder of Urban Ingenuity, as well as the co-founder of Evergreen Action. And Cullen, Howe, who's Senior Renewable Energy Advocate at NRDC. You can learn more about their bios at our website, but they have really incredible experience across city, state, and federal levels, and we are very fortunate to have them as our panelists. So without further ado, I'd like to jump right in, and we're going to start off, we're going to go federal, state, and then local and cross-cutting with environmental justice. Each speaker will talk for about 5 minutes to lay the landscape of what's going on in different geographies and aspects of solar and renewable energy policy. The panelists will then have about 20 minutes to talk amongst themselves, and then we'll end with a Q&A. So Bracken, let's start off with you. There's, of course, right now a lot of excitement and energy around federal policy for everything green. What do you expect that we'll see in Biden's first day of office and even throughout his first term?
So I guess jumping in, I actually think this is a pretty exciting moment for climate action. It's also a pretty challenging moment to move federal policy, and there's a tension there. Vice President Biden, now President Biden, I got to get used to saying that, actually ran on climate solutions in a way that we have not seen a presidential candidate do ever, really. His program was more ambitious than any previous presidential nominee, a $2 trillion package of investment. He led with a framework of standards, really elevating 100% clean energy by 2035, backing it with a big package of investment. And then he grounded everything in justice, talking about how this relates to frontline communities, it relates to fossil fuel industry transition, really linking it very, very closely in his own mind, I think. It's not a policy contrivance. I think it's authentic in his leadership commitment. The degree to which the administration, in all of their remarks in the inaugural yesterday, there are 4 interlocking crises that they've continuously elevated. First is COVID-19 and responding to this public health emergency. There's an economic crisis directly resulting from it. There is this challenge of racial and economic justice coming out of all of the issues of Black Lives Matter and police brutality and failures of democracy and the underlying history of redlining and disenfranchisement. And then he links all of that causally to climate change as this through line. If you're driving trillions of dollars investment, you've got to create jobs and in the right places. he carved out 40% of his clean energy investments to drive a frontline community-based job-creating clean energy deployment agenda. It's clearly linked to COVID. Do you believe in science? There's a short-term crisis and there's a long-term crisis directly related to governing through science. But it's also directly related through green buildings. There's a whole lot of tool belt jobs, manufacturing jobs, dealing with indoor air quality, ventilation systems, and it comes directly back to the built environment, to public infrastructure, public buildings. And all of this really, I think, tees up a program for distributed capital investment into energy infrastructure at the community level that accrues extremely well to the solar industry, to the urban environment, to the fabric of placemaking. It lines up with affordable housing. So where we go from that then is that there is a policy agenda that also flows from it. And I think we'll dig into these specifics more in dialogue. But in his 100 days commitment, the lead story was rejoining Paris, but it also has appliance standards. It has social cost of carbon, which is going to change infrastructure investment. And I expect very shortly, in the next stimulus package, the last stimulus package, we got ITC and PTC extension for tax credits. I expect that there will be a subsequent stimulus package that may deal with refundability of tax credits, that's going to deal with a lot of carve-outs. And there will be a whole set of things in appropriations, moving a clean energy standard, possibly through reconciliation as part of the budget, and then really moving this 40% equity screen for community-based investment that I think flows heavily towards distributed place-based clean energy resources. So maybe that's enough just to kind of tee up a set of issues, and we can deal with some of those particulars in discussion.
It's great, Bracken. Thank you. Very exciting landscape at the federal level. Cullen, now can you jump in? New York State has advanced progressive climate and energy laws and policies in recent years, including the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act and the Accelerated Siting Law. What's on the agenda for implementing these laws in 2021?
Yeah, happy to talk about that, and thanks for having me today. So I'll go over both of those laws, do a little bit of level setting, and then talk about one other thing that I think is important, which is some guidance document on the social cost of carbon. But anyway, with respect to the CLCPA, just so folks, I assume most folks know this, but I will run through it. It does a lot of important things. One of the things, top line things it does is set economy-wide emissions reductions, 40% reductions by 2030, 85% reductions by 2050. It also sets an overall electric sector clean energy target, which is called the Clean Energy Standard, of 70% by 2030. And then it sets 100% emissions-free electricity by 2040. And then it sets a number of sector-specific clean energy targets, 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035, 3,000 megawatts of energy storage by 2030, and perhaps most relevant for this call, 6,000 megawatts of distributed solar by 2025. Two things to say about that law in terms of implementation. One thing is the proceeding to establish 70 by 30. The Public Service Commission this past October adopted this, and in the order kind of established a roadmap for how we get there. And I'll just remind folks that right now we're at about 28% clean electricity. Most of that is large scale hydro. So going from 28 to 70% in 9 years is going to be very challenging. The other thing that the law does is it establishes the Climate Action Council. This is a 22-member body that will essentially figure out how we achieve these economy-wide targets. That council obviously has been established, is meeting. There are a number of working groups that are working on different issues. A draft scoping plan will be issued by the council at the end of this year. A final scoping plan will be issued in 2022. And then DEC will adopt regulations based on that scoping plan by 2024. Then to talk about the new siting law, this has it's a mouthful to say. It's called the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act. That was passed in April of 2020 as part of the state budget. It does a number of important things. One of the things it does is it establishes a new process for large-scale renewable projects, and those are projects over 25 megawatts to go through. As folks probably know on the call, up to now that has been done through Article 10 of the Public Service Law. I think most would agree that that process has not been very good. Among other things, it's taken very long to get through that process for projects, and we certainly need a better process. So this law establishes something called the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, or ORES. ORES has been tasked with coming up with new regulations. Those have come, the draft regulations were issued last year, and we expect final regulations to come out in the next couple of months. Most important takeaway is that under the law, this process can take no longer than 1 year. So that in and of itself would be a great improvement. And if we're really going to hit 70 by 30, we need to get these projects cited. We need to have that process go faster. So hopefully this will allow for that. There are some other important parts of that law around transmission and distribution investments. I'm going to skip that for now, but happy to talk about it later. The last thing I want to mention quickly is the social cost of carbon. The CLCPA required that DEC issue guidance on this by the end of 2020. They did. They issued final guidance. It came out in between Christmas and New Year, so most folks weren't paying attention. But what this does is it sets out guidance for state agencies to use when they have to figure out what actions to take to reduce emissions. The important takeaway from the guidance is that it sets, in my opinion, a very strong social cost of carbon by adopting what's called a 2% discount rate. I won't go into that now. I'm happy to talk about it. But effectively, what this means is that for 2020, the social cost of carbon for carbon dioxide is $125 per ton. So why is that important for solar? Well, one reason it's important for solar is because for large-scale projects that receive compensation through the value stack, the environmental value, or the E value, is set by either the larger of the social cost of carbon or the tier 1 REC price. What that means going forward is that this E value could be significantly higher than it has been, which would provide additional revenue for these projects. So developers are watching this very closely. It's not clear right now what DPS is going to do with this. There is some wiggle room in the guidance, and as the name suggests, it's guidance, it's not law. So we'll wait and see how that goes. But I will stop there and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Cullen. That was a really great summary of a lot of activity going on at the state level. And so as we all can see, there is a lot going on at this at a lot of different levels in New York State. There's substantial policy and investment likely to happen in the immediate future in the federal at the federal level. Now, Rich, can you take us locally to New York City? And what do you see as the greatest opportunity? Let's focus in part on one particular law, Local Law 97, which is part of the Climate Mobilization Act. Can you tell us what the greatest opportunities and challenges are to leverage that local law and advance an innovative green industry here in the city?
Sure, I'm happy to. First of all, Rob and Alexis, thanks for having me on this panel. It's great to be with everybody today. It's, in my world, it's a very exciting day. We're at day one of some great things ahead in the solar and broader clean energy world. And I think that Bracken's introduction really teased that up really nicely. Cullen has walked us through the opportunities at the state level, and there are equally exciting opportunities at the city level. And, just as a way to frame it, what I think we're seeing at every level of government is a convergence of interest and energy and creativity and commitment around how do we decarbonize our economy. That ideas that, before I came to Capalino to start our clean energy and sustainability practice, I spent a couple of decades at NRDC. And it was a premise of everything we did in those days was, could we create a policy structure that would drive investment in a lower carbon future? And that's now happening at every level of government. And so today is super exciting on many levels, and this is one of them. So at the city level, I think what's most exciting here is to look at the action taken about almost 2 years ago now. Something called the Climate Mobilization Act was passed by the council, led by council member Constantinidis, signed by the mayor, and it included a package of 5 different laws, including Local Law 97, which you referenced. And Local Law 97 is, I can describe it as the most ambitious bill to decarbonize buildings of any city government anywhere in the world. The way it works in brief is it creates a structure whereby the city's largest buildings, almost every building more than 25,000 square feet, has to do something to decarbonize the buildings. Now, the buildings are divided into building categories based on the building code occupancy groups. There are 10 of them that are covered by the law. There are pathways for houses of worship, for buildings that have significant amounts of affordable or rent regulated housing, for hospitals and healthcare facilities. And I won't go through all of those details, and I would refer you to the website on this that's run by Urban Green, which is fantastic, for a tutorial on any of these topics. But the gist of it is everybody has to do something if you're more than 25,000 square feet, with very limited exceptions. For most buildings, that means a retrofit. That means a retrofit to hit carbon goals that will be set, that kick in, the first ones in 2024, then 2030, 2035, and so on, until we hit the 80% reductions by 2050 target. And different buildings are going to do different things. But everybody will have to do something. And what it means for solar is very exciting, because there are 2 different compliance pathways that are great for solar, and that should be very intriguing for building owners who want to get off fossil fuels altogether. The first is obvious. It's install rooftop solar, get solar on the building, get off of fossil fuels entirely, and you're going to comply with Local Law 97. You're going to have fossil-free energy. You're going to have cleaner indoor air because there's no fossil fuels being burned in the basement. And your whole building environment is going to be better. That's the easy one to see. The second is to procure solar energy that's generated elsewhere, but transmitted directly into Zone J or New York City, and then used in your building. And in a very short time, I can't explain all the details of how that works, but basically, we now have a pathway whereby buildings can get Local Law 97 credit if they are part of a community solar process. They can get Local Law 97 credit if they find their way to procuring upstate solar. We've had this huge problem in New York, which is upstate solar, wind, other renewables are being generated, but transmitting that energy down to the city has been an ongoing challenge. Last week, the governor in the state of the state announced at least 3 new major transmission projects and other steps. Cullen touched on them. That will make it easier for buildings to procure solar. So I think there's really great opportunities in the building sector to decarbonize and defossilize their buildings using solar. whether it's on top of the roof or whether it's being part of community solar or by procuring solar that's being generated upstate. The challenge, if I may take a second on that, is that the rules are still being written. The rules won't be final till 2023. The first compliance date is 2024. That doesn't give a lot of time for building owners who are saying, hey, right now I want to make my plan. And I think that there's a lot of work going through to work all that out. I'm really optimistic. There's a great team in the buildings department led by Gina Bokra. There's great people at Mayor's Office of Sustainability who are all very cognizant of this challenge and working their way through it. Super optimistic today.
Thank you, Rich. Yeah, it's exciting to be in a place of optimism and that there's so much happening at all levels of government. It's also important that at all levels of government, environmental justice is advanced as a goal, as an imperative, and that clear processes and outcomes are in place and sought to be achieved. Adriana, you are uniquely positioned to advance environmental justice here in New York City. So could you explain what environmental justice goals the city has established and what challenges and opportunities 2021 might present to achieve these goals?
Sure. Thanks. And thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. So I'm going to borrow a word that my friend Rich Kassel used a second ago, convergence. We're seeing here this convergence on all levels of government towards aggressive climate action. I would assert that, the laws that Rich and Cullen went over happened at the state and local level before we had a Biden and Harris administration, right? So we were able to push climate action despite leadership on the federal government for the past few years. And now that we have that, again, we have this convergence towards really addressing the climate crisis. And from my perspective, it's important that as we are implementing all of this legislation and as we are, on the cusp of this clean energy transition, that we make sure that it is a just transition and that we're not just focused, laser focused on reducing greenhouse gases and getting to clean energy, but that we're doing so in a way that puts environmental health, particularly those in low-income communities and communities of color, at the center of those efforts, so that we're not just addressing climate change, but we're also ensuring that communities that are overburdened by pollution benefit from this transition to clean energy. And there are many programs as it relates to solar in the city, that work on the renewable energy side. My colleagues in the Mayor's Office of Sustainability sort of run point on the city's long-term energy goals and plans there. We have lots of renewable energy goals in One NYC 2050, which is the city's strategic plan to get carbon neutral to the city by 2050. And then we also have on the city's envelope, specifically the DCAS and their Division of Energy Management. They sort of manage the city's portfolio of their renewable energy. And so where I sit in the Mayor's Office of Climate Policy and Programs is running the city's first environmental justice program. And that sort of looks at all of it and tries to make sure that we are weaving environmental justice into the decision-making, not just about clean energy, including but not limited to about clean energy, but also about how we are making decisions about land use and siting and health policy and parks and all of it. So I'm working to implement two local laws, 60 and 64 that passed back in 2017, which requires the city to codify environmental justice into the city's decision-making really across agencies. And so I lead an interagency working group that has about 19 different city agencies, and also work with an external advisory board of community-based organizations, national environmental justice leaders, subject matter experts from academic institutions, and to really do this work. And we're focused on really three main products to achieve this mission of embedding EJ into the city's decision making. The first, which I can get into more in the discussion, but is the city's first comprehensive study of environmental justice, which is to understand where are the city's environmental justice communities, what are the issues that they are facing as it relates to air quality or access to parks, housing quality, access to the benefits of the city's Green New Deal as well. Really sort of outlines all of that, and using that study to then create two things. The first is a environmental justice data portal and mapping tool. So we give direct access to all of the city's environmental justice data in an online portal for folks, and we can allow them to put in their own zip code or their address, see, do they live in one of these EJ communities? What does that mean? How does their air quality stack up against others? Things like that. And giving them access to download the city's own data so they can use for their own purposes of community-based planning and action plans or how they see fit. And then finally, there is an environmental justice plan, which is to be done in partnership with the interagency group and the advisory board group that I mentioned a second ago, which makes discrete recommendations on taking from what we learned in the study, how do we both reform how we internally as a city make decisions about environmental justice, what sort of processes and matrix that we look at when we're making decisions. Also, recommendations on initiatives that the city should undertake to advance environmental justice, and by that I mean closing any disparities or gaps that we see in environmental degradation and burdens as well, and sort of identifying where we can, reach a more just and equitable future. And so that's the role that I have here. And you'll see that it's not directly on solar energy, but there's a through line there to make sure that everything that the city is doing is done within that lens, which I would think is a transformative thing that the city of New York is taking on for the first time.
Thank you, Adriana. It's exciting to see what's happening and is formally being recognized and implemented by the city that's been taking place at the community level for a very long time. So it's a very important role that right now one person is undertaking. That's great. So to take a step back for the panel discussion, then let's talk about some learning lessons, right? That the good news is where the environmental movement is not about implementing one policy or a couple piecemeal policies, but it's about scaling what's already been taking place and taking the best of learning, adapting, and bringing to a new level. So starting at the federal level, again, because that's top of mind, Bracken, can you start us off, and then please, everybody feel free to, all the panelists, please jump in around what important lessons have been learned, say, from the Obama administration when there was a somewhat parallel situation of a stimulus package that was developed in a hurry and had some pretty broad sweeping impacts, and how the Biden administration can learn from that and seek to have an even deeper impact than before.
Sure. I think we've come a huge distance just in the last 4 years, in the last 10 years, in terms of thinking on climate policy and clean energy policy. And I think we're in a fundamentally different place than we were. I mentioned this concept of standards, investment, and justice as like a coherent framework. That's how the Biden and Harris administration is talking about clean energy. It's how Democratic leadership are talking about clean energy. It's fundamentally deployment focused. And it's an inversion of the previous 10 years of climate policy built around price signals macroeconomic cap and trade. We're going to make it expensive to pollute, and that will sort of trickle down through the regulatory system, and it'll all make sense on the ground. That's been flipped. We're talking about how do you set a high bar in the rules, back it with public investment to make doing the right thing cheaper and easier and faster. You know, the market signals are helpful. It's working in certain places to set up, you know, a funding mechanism principally. It's also raising a lot of environmental justice concerns. And I think the elevation of EJ and the concern around hotspots from market-based mechanisms, if you allow polluting power plants to persist, this focuses you on the deployment of the clean stuff. So that's a big shift from what happened under the Obama administration. One of the most important early clean energy tools was the Recovery Act. There was $90 billion of capital investment. And one of the most important tools was the refundability of the production tax credit and the investment tax credit through something called the 1603 Treasury grant program, right? It basically turned the tax equity market into a grant so that nonprofits could access subsidy into projects, or for-profit projects that couldn't monetize it because there was a downturn in the economy. They could take those tax credits and just put the dollars straight into projects. It was probably the single most effective piece of the whole Recovery Act. But you also had things like the Energy Efficiency Conservation Block Grant that moved money down to states and cities for decarbonizing urban infrastructure, a big push on shovel-ready transit projects, and a range of different deployment mechanisms, running money through state energy offices to get money into community-based partners' hands. I just want to comment on one more piece, though, because what you just heard with Cullen and the states and with Rich on the city, it's not an accident that there is an alignment with the federal policy and what's happening in New York right now. We started Evergreen Action coming out of the Inslee campaign. We had a mandate with Governor Inslee to lay out a clean energy roadmap that we could act on immediately. A big piece of what we actually did was look to leading cities and states, and key pieces that moved into the Inslee plan, then into the Warren plan, into the Obama plan, into the Biden-Harris plan ultimately, actually draw from some of the types of EJ examples Adriana was talking about. The notion of an equity screen based on census tracts and zip codes and cumulative impacts from air pollution or from the positive dollars spent, that's now in federal policy directly as a result of key policies drawn from New York City, from California, and from Washington State, filtered through, and it's now in the federal agenda. The 40% for environmental justice, again, drawing from New York State's commitments about focusing on disadvantaged communities. A high bar for 100% clean energy at the national level comes from the state programs. So I think what we're seeing is a convergence on investment. We got to look to stimulus. We've got to look to executive actions, and I'm sure others have specific thoughts about taking this from the federal down to the city and the state.
Great, and to build from that, then, Rich, what have you seen around? This goes to one of the questions, and it builds nicely from Bracken's comments. How can other cities, though we're early in the process with Local Law 97, how can other cities begin to adapt their own versions of a Local Law 97 or certain building standards with penalties? I know this is a question that say Ellen Conrad from Bedford was wondering, and so to take lessons from here and to throw the question out more broadly, Adriana, New York City's done a lot and is doing a lot, but how can that be translated into policies, let it be for other municipalities or state or federal levels?
Sure. So, Ellen, it's a great question. You know, the last 4 years, there was this incredible, as we all know, vacuum at the top, where the federal government was not providing leadership on climate strategies. And in that vacuum came cities and states that were developing all sorts of innovative policies and programs to advance energy efficiency and the broader decarbonization effort. And while this was it was an extreme example of that, but the reality is that cities and states have always been the laboratories for new policy ideas that eventually move their way up to the federal level. And I think it would be hard to find an example of a major domestic policy advancement that hadn't already been tested at city and state levels. And over the last 4 years, New York City, California, but many other cities too, were working together to develop all types of model legislation, model programs. And so Local Law 97 fits into that very nicely, as does, by the way, Local Law 96, which authorized property assessed clean energy financing or PACE financing as a way to help pay for the energy efficiency investments, whereby building owners can use their property tax assessments as a way to finance long-term investments on the capital side, fixed rate, long-term financing, no more personal guarantees. You pay it back through a special assessment of the property tax bill. That's a whole nother webinar topic, I suspect. But the concept here is that other cities can absolutely adapt what New York City is doing. So can other countries, frankly. So I think that the idea of adapting what's already been done and what's already working is really great. And it's great for two reasons. One is no need to reinvent the wheel, but the other is that our ultimate success is based on economies of scale and scaling up the adaptation of technologies and adaptation of models that work. And so if other cities look at what we're doing and say, hey, that's a good model, and they adapt it, well, that sends a signal to the industry that there's a bigger market than they originally planned, and we will scale. There's more than half of the states have now adopted 80 by 50 or net zero, some form of carbon goal like that. And that is creating a huge, huge opportunity for adapting local laws, not just to Bedford, but throughout the whole country.
Could add to what Rich was saying there. So I appreciate Bracken, sort of laying out the path of from the Inslee plan and to the Warren plan all the way, to the climate plan for the Biden-Harris administration, and recognizing that there's so much influence from New York, and I think that's true, and I think that's why it is even more so just critically important that we get this right, both on from the policy front, of course, but also on the process front. And what I'm interested in specifically is how we are defining disadvantaged communities, environmental justice communities on the state level with the CLCPA, on the city level with the city's EJ laws, because as has been mentioned here, this is going to serve as a model for cities, states, and even the federal government, around the country. And it's important that from the policy front that we get that right, but on the process front, that overburdened and frontline communities have a seat at the table in defining and making those rules. And I see that happening on the state level with the CLCPA, and they're working on defining disadvantaged communities. That's going to help drive where that 40% investment which communities that actually goes to. And there's a climate justice working group that is working on that definition. And it's important for other cities and states and the Biden-Harris administration to see that happening in real time, so that they know that those are the kind of people that we need to have at the table, instead of a top-down government decides how it works, and then and then they roll out the rules, and then that's how it is. And I think similarly on my front, on the city level with defining, we have a definition of EJ community laid out in local law 64, but we are looking to open up the EJ study and bring in a citywide public comment period to be part of this process, so that the city isn't deciding what environmental justice issues to study and how they're defining what is happening in EJ communities, that is informed by people on the ground who are living them every day. And so those are the types of process things that I would say New York State and city are both doing that needs to be done right, so that, as other entities do it as well, they follow.
Thank you. So let's do a slightly deeper dive in, and Cullen, I'll get to you in a minute, but to stick on the city policy question, I think is a really important case study that's being developed in real time. Nancy Anderson, great to see you on the webinar. Asked a great question. Right? Local Law 97 has very ambitious greenhouse gas goals, and the law creates several compliance paths, one of them enabling the creation of a carbon emissions trading market as a means for building owners to reach compliance. What's the status of developing such a market, and how will it address EJ concerns about how such a market might concentrate a high concentration of greenhouse gas emissions in buildings and communities? And I'd add on to that as well, if there are certain penalties in place if dollars are able to be channeled towards specialized programs and policies in EJ communities. So Adriana and Rich, I think this is a great question for the two of you to take head on.
Sure. So I'll start, and then Rich, you can add into that. So first of all, hi Nancy, nice that you're here. So yes, there is a carbon trading study that's required as part of Local Law 97 that is being spearheaded out of the Mayor's Office of Sustainability, and they have a project study team, and that process is ongoing. And I estimate will wrap up within the next few months. But as far as the question on how that relates to environmental justice, so I would say there are two important things that were written into Local Law 97 as it relates to carbon trading. The first is that I've been pretty directly involved in the carbon trading study process, because especially because it was written into Local Law 97. So this was Local Law 97 is a climate bill that was passed after the city's EJ bill, and so they referred directly to the EJ law and said, like, the EJ advisory board and the EJ senior advisor needs to be involved in this process. So that's kind of this sort of calls back to what I was mentioning earlier in like how we weave in EJ into the city's policymaking. But I guess the main point that I wanted to make is that there is a requirement for the carbon trading study that it looks at impacts to the city's EJ communities, and that the city not consider any carbon trading program that would increase pollutants in environmental justice communities, that would reduce the overall greenhouse gas emissions to that would happen as under a baseline Local Law 97. And so there are strong guide rails, I would say, to the carbon trading study built in there, so that so that we are for the purposes of driving more energy efficiency or getting driving down emissions overall, that there aren't any negative unintended consequences on people who are already pollution burdened. And so those are two things that are built into the carbon trading study.
Yeah, and I'll add, that was great. I'll add that I think that we've come a long way in understanding how to establish carbon trading and price of carbon programs in ways that will not exacerbate disproportionate impacts in low-income communities and communities of color. In the early days of carbon trading, I'll go all the way back to the Reclaim program in Southern California that really created, I think, the widespread sense that that carbon trading could result in increases in emissions in environmental justice communities, even if it's decreasing overall air pollution. We've learned a lot since then. And so, if you look at the cap and trade program that exists today in California, it's many, many generations more advanced than what was done by Reclaim at the very beginning. But the concern is still the right concern, which is how do we create a program that's sophisticated enough to ensure that we're both addressing the macro environmental issue of citywide, statewide, nationwide, global emissions reductions targets, while also addressing the very micro and critically important issues that are happening at a community level. And I think we have the tools now to do that. And I think that the city's program is a very thoughtful way to figure out how do we do it here in a building's context to ensure that we're meeting both the the macro needs and the community level needs at the same time.
I want to just add just one quick note here that there is also a public comment period for the carbon trading study, and you can go online and sort of see where they are in the process, when they expect results. And Nancy, if you wanted to add in, or anyone on the webinar want to add their 2 cents, I will see if I can work with the host to send around a link to that.
Great, thank you. So Cullen, to put you on the spot for a minute, we have some questions have come up around local opposition to ground-mounted solar in upstate New York. Some saying it's not necessary. Again, we're looking at Bedford. Is there enough solar being developed upstate? And what other benefits? I'll put out a couple questions and then you can prioritize. What other benefits could accrue to suburban towns by having locally generated solar? And then on a somewhat similar note, there's this really a question of if it's possible to transmit energy from upstate New York down to the city, or if there are limitations, what it means to be able to procure solar, if it's even possible right now to procure solar from upstate New York down here in the city. So I think the themes here are local benefits of community solar upstate, transmission, and the ability to achieve the ambitious climate goals with projects upstate alone, or do we need to look at other opportunities as well?
Okay, I'll try to answer that kind of. I don't know if I can answer all of that. And
those 3 questions.
Well, I'll just say this. I mean, local opposition to large-scale renewables is nothing new. It's been happening for as long as these projects have been developed. And now that we're going to have more of these projects, it's likely to have more opposition, and so that's to be expected. Some of this opposition, I think, is legitimate. Some of it may not be legitimate, or maybe for reasons that I would consider not to be legitimate. But what we do know is that in the latest procurement awards that NYSERDA just gave out, I think it was last week, almost all of it was solar. I think there were a few wind projects and a couple other projects, but most of it was solar. And I think most of those projects are upstate. So we are going to have a lot of solar upstate. And some of these projects are quite large. And so what that means is solar projects, the one I think aspect of solar is that they do require a fair amount of land to put the panels on. So you can't miss these. If you drive by them, you will see them. They will be acres and acres of solar panels. And there is a debate about whether that's the best use of that land, if there's other things that can be done. But I think going forward, that's going to be the reality. We're going to see a lot of that, and it seems like because a lot of these projects were awarded that were solar. Solar is right now, it looks like the cheapest, slightly cheaper than land-based wind. So I think it's to say we're going to see more of that. The benefits thing, I I can talk a little bit about. I'll just say real briefly, and I know we don't have a lot of time left. There was an aspect of the siting bill that creates a program which is still being implemented to sort of have a local benefits agreement, which effectively would provide bill discounts for folks' utilities bills that live within a certain area around these projects. That is still being worked out. They asked, there's a comment period that ended a couple of weeks ago. And, you know, again, I don't, this is not a bad idea. It's certainly not going to eliminate the opposition, but I think it was at least a first step for the state to try to address that, where, you know, I think it's a legitimate argument to say for these communities that what are we getting out of this? You know, you are getting clean energy that's being fed into the grid. Some of that stays in those communities, some of that goes other places. But it's certainly something that we're going to have to address more in the future. Real quick about transmission, I think it's right now, and this is, I didn't touch on in my initial presentation, transmission is a real issue. Right now, we do not have enough of it to get, you know, upstate clean energy to downstate. There's a lot of things that are happening on that front, but simply put, we need more of it because we don't have it.
Can I jump in?
Please.
We talked a lot about policy, federal, state, local. I think that at the moment there's a comment that just came up in the Q&A feed about property tax shortfalls and stress on local budgets and subsidies and incentives that are available. And I just want to take a moment to call attention to non-policy driven tools. There's a lot of market business model innovation going on. And in New York, you have NYSEC, New York City Energy Efficiency Corporation, with a set of tools. The commercial PACE was recently mentioned. Urban Ingenuity, my company, runs the DC PACE program. We've used PACE effectively for low-income housing tax credit deals. We've done tax-exempt PACE for nonprofits. You're seeing philanthropies or union pension funds and impact investors helping drive down the cost of deployment. I think in a market that has strong electricity regulation and a strong renewable standard creating pull on the market, you know, Rob, you yourself have been doing some really innovative structuring around affordable housing and solar, as have we. I think there are these pieces of the market that are really poised to grow, where they care about life cycle costs, where you can come in with a solution that has really good long-term savings in terms of managing properties, and also really good resilience attributes, and is also creating locational advantage within the New York market structure. So I think we should think really hard about policy, but I think there's a lot that can be done just within the structure of deals and just making more projects viable. And again, I think New York City and state are poised to really lead the country for an explosion of deployment.
Definitely. And to build off of that, Rich, I know that you've had some thoughts about how innovation can be driven and entrepreneurship can be led through let it be existing laws and policies, as well as those that are as well as as the rules are being developed, they can help to encourage still more economic activity. Do you want to talk about what your activities are and how we could use this opportunity?
Sure, thanks. So Rob, I think then this really builds off of what Bracken was saying as well. These policies that are being put in place are generating innovation, and they're generating innovation in all sorts of exciting ways, startups and other companies that are developing new technology tools and solutions to solve what had been intractable energy efficiency or building management problems. And we need to make sure that the policy architecture is flexible enough and encouraging enough so that these ideas can actually come in, be demonstrated, be proved, if they work and they're proven, that they get integrated into the implementation architecture. Let me give you one quick example. I'm doing some work with a company called Carbon Quest. Carbon Quest is creating the first ever carbon capture program built to scale down to a New York City apartment house. I know I have a minute left. So the question is, Local Law 97 didn't anticipate carbon capture in a New York City apartment building, but it should, and it should, the implementation should be flexible enough so that it encourages 1,000 Carbon Quests to come in and say, hey, I got a new idea to solve this problem. And if I prove it works, building owners will want to use it and it'll scale because they're going to get Local Law 97 compliance credit for having come up with, and integrated this new, more cost-effective way to meet a carbon goal. I know I'm out of town. There's a lot more to say. That'll be the next webinar.
Thank you, Rich. Well, we've had a great discussion. Alexis, do you want to conclude and take us out here?
Sure. I just, thanks so much to Rob and to the panelists for the discussion. It feels like we're really just getting warmed up, which is environment, and lots of hope on the policy side, financing side, technological innovation, process, and incorporating environmental justice concerns. So for today, at least, it feels like we're moving in the right direction, and I think we'll take what we can get. So this program has been recorded. We'll circulate the recording to everyone who registered and posted on social media, so you can share it with your friends. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining, and enjoy the rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.